Some things cannot be said out loud, not because the words do not exist, and not because the person who needs to say them lacks the courage in ordinary circumstances, but because the weight of what needs to be communicated exceeds what ordinary language can carry. There are moments in a life when the available vocabulary simply fails, when the distance between what happened and what can be spoken is too wide to cross with a sentence, a conversation, a letter. In those moments, people find other ways. They gesture, they go silent, they make art. John Lennon made songs. He made them for his whole life, songs that were at their best, capable of carrying emotional freight that his speaking voice could not manage, that his face in a press conference could not reveal without the protective distance of melody and arrangement. And on at least one occasion, one particular song, recorded in one of the most exposed creative periods of his career, he made one that functioned, whether he could have named it as such or not, as an apology. Not a public apology, not performed contrition, something more interior and more costly, the sound of a person reckoning, honestly and without softening, with what they had not been able to give. The question of who he was giving it to would take years to fully understand. But the story of that song begins, as so many of John Lennon's stories begin, with loss. Alfred Lennon, Freddie, to those who knew him, was a merchant seaman who was largely absent from his son's life from the beginning. He left when John was very young, resurfacing occasionally in ways that seemed to promise consistency, and then retreating again into the distances that his work and his nature both demanded. John was 5 years old when his parents separated, and he was sent to live with his Aunt Mimi in Woolton. He was not told everything. Children rarely are, but children understand more than they are told, and what John understood, in the wordless way of young children, was that his father had chosen to be elsewhere. The effect of this understanding did not announce itself cleanly. It went underground, the way the effects of early loss so often do, surfacing unexpectedly in the quality of his humor, in the specific texture of his defenses, in the particular kind of restlessness that drove him toward music and kept him there even when every practical consideration argued for stopping. The wound that Alfred's absence created was not the kind that healed by being named. It was the kind that became structural, part of the architecture of the person who grew around it. Julia, his mother, was warm and present in her own way, visits across the city, banjo lessons in the sitting room, the looseness and joy she brought to everything she touched. But Julia was also absent in a different sense. She was not the one who raised him. She was the one he visited. And in 1958, when John was 17, she was killed by a car near her home, and the possibility of that relationship becoming something more settled was removed permanently. He was left holding two kinds of absence, his father's chosen absence and his mother's involuntary one, both enormous, neither fully speakable. He did what he always did when the world gave him something he could not process in ordinary language. He picked up a guitar, he played. He eventually wrote. The songs that came from these losses did not arrive all at once. They came in fragments over years, emerging when the creative conditions were right and the defensive structures around John's private self had loosened enough to let something real through. He was not, by temperament or training, a confessional artist in the straightforward sense. He was deeply private about the things that mattered most, even as he performed a version of openness that the public mistook for the whole picture. The wit, the irreverence, the willingness to say provocative things in interviews, these were real, but they were also covering something that only appeared in the music, in certain songs, at certain moments when the craft and the need arrived at the same place simultaneously. By the late 1960s, the craft and the need were converging in ways that were difficult to manage. The Beatles had dissolved under the cumulative weight of artistic divergence and personal tension. Brian Epstein, who had shaped and protected the band through its most vulnerable years, had died in 1967. The collaborative structure that had sustained John's creative life for a decade was gone. He was alone with himself in a new way, and what he found there was not always comfortable. He had moved to New York with Yoko Ono, navigating the complicated public aftermath of the Beatles' dissolution, while simultaneously trying to establish what his life looked like without the frame that had contained it for a decade. The press was not kind. The public that had adored John Lennon the Beatle was not entirely prepared for John Lennon the individual, the person who had opinions and spoke them loudly, who made confrontational art, who refused to perform the nostalgia that the world was already beginning to demand of him. He was also in therapy, working with American therapist Arthur Janov, whose primal therapy methodology was built on the premise that psychological wounds could be reached only by returning to their source, by allowing the original pain to surface completely, without the management and deflection that adult life typically applies. For John, who had spent his entire life becoming extraordinarily skilled at managing and deflecting his original pain, the process was both terrifying and liberating. Janov's approach required a particular kind of surrender, the willingness to be temporarily helpless, to let the constructed adult self stand aside while something older and less defended rose to the surface. John was not, by nature, a person who surrendered easily, but he was also a person who had been waiting a very long time to feel the things he had been carrying without language since childhood. It produced, among other things, the Plastic Ono Band album. Recorded in the autumn of 1970 at Ascot Sound Studios in Abbey Road, working with producer Phil Spector and engineer Eddie Kramer, the Plastic Ono Band album was unlike anything John had released before. It was sparse to the point of austerity: drums, bass, piano, voice, and almost nothing else. No orchestration, no layering, no production decisions designed to make the listening experience more comfortable. It was a record that refused to soften itself. The sessions were intense in ways that people who were present have described with careful language, as if the intensity remained in the memory and required handling. John sang looking directly at the microphone rather than through it or away from it, as if maintaining contact with the object of transmission was necessary for the truth to travel correctly. He did few takes of most songs, not because the performances were technically perfect, but because additional takes would have introduced the self-consciousness that the whole project was trying to escape. Among the songs recorded in those sessions was one called Mother. It began with the tolling of a slow church bell, 4 strikes, deliberate and heavy, the sound of something being marked that could not be unmarked. And then John's voice, unaccompanied at first, the words direct and stripped of every literary ornament, the language of a child rather than a poet. That was deliberate. Primal therapy worked by reaching the place before sophistication, before the adult mind had developed the eloquence that also functions as concealment. The language of Mother was the language of the wound before. Wound had learned to dress itself. He sang about his mother first, then he turned in the second verse to his father. The structure of the song placed them in parallel, two people who had not been there, addressed in the same breath, held in the same grief. Then at the end of the song, something unusual happened. John abandoned the composed lyric and began to scream. Not the rock and roll scream of performance and release, but something rawer, the sound, quite literally, of a person in pain. He screamed the word mama. He screamed it repeatedly, the voice breaking and rebuilding and breaking again. Producer Phil Spector later said that the control room went completely silent during that final section. Engineer Eddie Kramer did not speak. No one reached for the talkback button to suggest another take. Everyone in the room understood, without discussing it, that what they had just recorded was not a performance. But Mother, for all its rawness, was not the song that functioned as an apology in the way this story means. That song came differently and later, and from a direction that no one, including John, would have easily predicted. In 1971, Alfred Lennon released a single. He had made attempts at a music career of his own, and the single, titled That's My Life, was a piece of work that addressed, in its own way, the question of Alfred's relationship with his famous son. John heard it, and what he felt when he heard it was complicated enough that it took him time to find the right container for it. Alfred was not a villain, that was the difficulty. He was a man who had made choices that caused real harm, and who had lived with the consequences of those choices in ways that had their own kind of cost. The narrative of the absent father who simply did not care was neater and more manageable than the truth, which was messier. A man who was limited, who was not equipped for what fatherhood required, who had failed his son without the failure arising from simple malice. John had spent years carrying the simpler narrative. It was easier to carry. Anger is easier to carry than understanding. But the understanding was there underneath the anger, and it surfaced in 1971 in a song called God, or more precisely, in the specific emotional geography of a verse that addressed not Alfred directly, but the whole question of what you let go of when you stop expecting someone to be what they were not capable of being. I don't believe in Elvis, John sang. I don't believe in Zimmerman. I don't believe in Beatles. The song moved through litany of things he was releasing, beliefs, icons, structures that had organized his world and his identity, and at its center was something that could only be described as forgiveness. Not the announced forgiveness of a public statement, the quieter, more costly forgiveness of someone who has stopped requiring a person to have been different than they were. He did not name Alfred in the song. He did not need to. The emotional architecture of the song was doing the work that the name would have reduced. The question of whether John ever fully made peace with Alfred during his father's lifetime is not one that resolves cleanly. They met in the years that followed on occasions that were awkward and provisional and weighted with everything that had not been said between them for decades. Alfred tried to write about John. John was guarded and then sometimes less guarded and then guarded again. The relationship resisted the neat closure that retrospective accounts tend to impose on complicated father-son dynamics. What is clear is that the music continued to carry what the direct relationship could not. In 1974, recording the Walls and Bridges album in New York, John wrote a song called Nobody Loves You When You're Down and Out. It was ostensibly about the fickleness of the music industry and the particular loneliness of a public figure who discovers how conditional public affection is. But underneath that surface, and not very far underneath, there was something more personal, the voice of someone who had been told, through the earliest and most formative experience of his life, that love was conditional on presence, and who had spent the intervening decades discovering that this lesson, learned so young and so deeply, was both true and insufficient. He sang it with a weariness that was not performed. This was not the theatrical weariness of a performer working within a genre. It was the specific exhaustion of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has stopped pretending it is light. By the late 1970s, John had settled into a period of domesticity in New York that surprised almost everyone who thought they knew him. He was raising his son Sean, born in 1975, with an attention and presence that was, in some respects, a direct response to the absence he himself had experienced. He cooked. He was present for school mornings and bedtimes and the ordinary texture of a child's daily life. He was doing, deliberately and with full awareness of what he was doing, what Alfred had not done for him. This was not spoken about in interviews. As an act of reparation, John was not the kind of person who announced his psychological insights as biographical fact. But the people close to him understood that the quality of his presence with Sean was connected to the quality of Alfred's absence with John, that he was, in the most practical and sustained way available to him, offering the thing he had been denied. That is its own kind of apology, not a song this time, a life lived in deliberate correction of the pattern. Yoko Ono, who understood John more completely than almost anyone, said in later years that the 5 years John spent at home with Sean were the most at peace she had ever seen him. Not happy in the uncomplicated sense, he was never uncomplicated, but settled, as if something that had been requiring enormous energy to hold in place had been, slowly and without announcement. Released in 1980, John returned to the studio. He and Yoko recorded Double Fantasy, an album that was, in its emotional register, the sound of someone who had reached a particular kind of equanimity. The songs were not naive. They were not the product of someone who had resolved every difficulty and arrived at a place of permanent calm. They were the product of someone who had lived long enough with the difficulties to have learned that resolution is not the only available relationship with pain, that you can carry something and also, gradually, not be defined by it. Starting Over, the album's opening track, was as close as John came in his final work to a direct address, to Yoko, to himself, to the life they were choosing to continue together. But embedded in the album, in the spaces between the declared intentions, was the sound of a man who had made his peace not with everything, but with enough. He had apologized over the years in every way that was available to him, in music that named the wound before he had language for it, in songs that moved through anger toward something more difficult and more durable, in the daily practice of being present for his son in ways that required nothing from the past except acknowledgement. In the quiet, unceremonious work of becoming someone who had stopped requiring the world to have been different. Alfred Lennon died in 1976. John had seen him in the intervening years. Whether the visits had been sufficient, whether they had carried enough of what needed to pass between them, is not something anyone can know from the outside. What is known is that John went back to the studio in 1980 and made music that sounded like a man still standing. Still reaching, still finding in sound the things that words could not hold. He was shot and killed on December 8, 1980, outside his home at the Dakota building in New York City. He was 40 years old. The music he had made, the apologies, the accusations, the love songs, the political anthems, the raw excavations of the private self, continued to play. It continues now. It will continue past now, carried by everyone who has ever needed a voice that sounded honest rather than resolved, that acknowledged the damage without being destroyed by it. That was the apology, repeated in different forms across 30 years of music, never quite finished, always being made. The best apologies are like that. They are not moments, they are directions.